Some bonds run deeper than blood, and some lessons can only be learned through hardship. In the dusty streets of Redstone Ridge, respect isn't given. It's earned through grit, honor, and sometimes a good fight. When young outlaw Cole Ironfist McGraw foolishly kicks Brutus, the loyal German shepherd of weathered cowboy Elijah Ward, he triggers a chain of events that will change both their lives forever. Brutus isn't just any dog, he's a trained bear hunter with the scars to prove it. Instead of seeking revenge, Elijah offers something far more valuable, a chance for redemption. But can a hardened criminal truly change? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This powerful tale of redemption will test everything you think you know about second chances in the Old West. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered planks of Redstone Ridge's main street, painting the dusty thoroughfare in shades of amber and gold. Elijah Ward stepped onto the porch of his modest cabin, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee that had seen better days. At 62, his frame still carried the strength of a man who had spent his life wrestling with nature itself. Though time had etched deep lines around his steel-grey eyes and silvered his once dark beard, Brutus emerged from the cabin's cool interior, his massive German shepherd frame moving with the deliberate grace of a predator who had learned patience through necessity. The dog's black and tan coat bore the testament of countless encounters with the wilderness, a network of pale scars that told stories of survival against bears, wolves, and worse. The most prominent mark ran along his muzzle, a raised line of scar tissue where a grizzly's claw had nearly ended his hunting days. 5 winters passed. Elijah's calloused fingers found the familiar groove behind Brutus's ears, a ritual that had begun every morning for 8 years now. "Another day, old friend," he murmured, his voice carrying the gravelly undertone of a man who chose his words carefully. The dog's amber eyes reflected an intelligence that went beyond mere training. This was a partnership forged in the crucible of shared danger. The cabin itself stood as a monument to Elijah's philosophy of simple living. Built from local pine and riverstone, it demanded nothing from the land it couldn't give back. Solar panels, a rare concession to modernity, caught the early light on the south-facing roof, providing just enough power for basic necessities. A hand-pumped, well-supplied water that tasted of mountain minerals and honest work. Behind the cabin, a small corral held Thunder, Elijah's aging quarter-horse, whose chestnut coat had faded to the color of autumn leaves. The horse had been his companion through 15 years of ranch work before arthritis forced them both into a gentler retirement. Now Thunder served mainly as a reminder of days when a man's worth could be measured in his ability to read the land and respect its moods. The town of Redstone Ridge stretched before them like a living museum of the American West, false-fronted. Buildings lined both sides of the main street, their paint faded, but their bones solid. The Silver Dollar Saloon anchored one end of the commercial district, its batwing doors already propped open despite the early hour. At the other end, Martha Hendricks ran the general store with the same iron efficiency she'd brought to raising 5 children and burying 2 husbands. Between these landmarks, the rhythms of small-town life played out with clockwork regularity. Doc Peterson made his morning rounds, his medical bag a familiar sight as he checked on the elderly and infirm. The blacksmith's hammer rang against anvil, sending sparks into the dry air. Children who should have been in school chased chickens through the dust, their laughter mixing with the complaints of shopkeepers and the occasional curse from the saloon. Elijah had chosen this place deliberately, drawn by its isolation and the kind of people who understood that some things couldn't be bought or sold. After 30 years working ranches from Montana to Texas, he'd saved enough to buy his plot of land and build his simple life. The townspeople accepted him without prying into his past, recognizing in his steady demeanor and gentle way with animals a man who had earned his peace. The morning routine continued as Elijah filled Brutus's water bowl from the well. the pump handle requiring 3 firm strokes to bring up the cold, clear water. The dog drank deeply, then settled into his favorite spot on the porch where he could observe the street while remaining in shade. This was their watchpost, a place where man and dog could read the pulse of their small world. It was from this vantage point that they first saw trouble approaching. Cole, Ironfist McGraw, rode into town like a storm system, all bluster and unpredictable energy. At 26, he carried himself with the swagger of youth that hadn't yet learned the difference between confidence and arrogance. His black stallion, clearly stolen given its quality and the nervous way Cole kept glancing over his shoulder, pranced and snorted beneath him. Responding to its rider's restless energy, Cole's reputation had preceded him by several weeks. Wanted posters bearing his likeness had appeared on the sheriff's office door, describing a string of robberies across 3 counties. The reward wasn't substantial enough to make bounty hunting profitable, but it was enough to make honest citizens nervous. He was known for his quick fists, hence the nickname Ironfist, and his quicker temper. From his porch, Elijah studied the young man with the patience of someone who had learned to read character in the set of shoulders and the way a person treated his horse. Cole's movement spoke of constant alertness, the hypervigilance of someone who expected trouble around every corner. His clothes were expensive but travel-stained, suggesting recent prosperity obtained through questionable means. Brutus sensed the tension immediately. The dog's ears pricked forward, and his body shifted into the alert posture that Elijah recognized from their hunting days. This wasn't the casual interest Brutus showed in newcomers. This was the focused attention of a predator evaluating potential threat. Cole dismounted in front of the silver dollar with unnecessary flourish, making a show of adjusting his gun belt and straightening his hat. Several townspeople had already retreated indoors, leaving the street noticeably quieter than moments before. This was the kind of careful distance small communities maintained around dangerous strangers. "Easy, boy," Elijah murmured to Brutus, though he made no move to go inside himself. There was something about this moment that demanded witnessing, a quality of inevitability that experienced men learned to recognize. The young outlaw swaggered toward the saloon, his spurs jingling with each step. As he passed near Elijah's cabin, his gaze fell on Brutus. Perhaps it was boredom, or the need to assert dominance in a new place, or simply the thoughtless cruelty that sometimes possessed young men who had confused fear with respect. Whatever the reason, Cole veered from his path toward the saloon and approached the porch where the dog lay quietly observing. "That's a fine-looking dog," Cole called out, though his tone carried an edge that made Elijah's jaw tighten. "Looks like he might be getting soft, lying around in the shade all day." Elijah set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "He's earned his rest," he replied, his voice level, but carrying a warning that Cole either didn't hear or chose to ignore. "Every dog needs to know who's boss," Cole said. And before Elijah could react, he drew back his right boot and delivered a sharp kick to Brutus's ribs. The world seemed to freeze for a heartbeat. Brutus rose to his feet with fluid grace, his amber eyes fixed on Cole with the kind of attention he usually reserved for wounded bears. A low growl rumbled from deep in his chest, a sound that spoke of barely contained violence. Elijah stood slowly, his own eyes never leaving Cole's face. "Son," he said quietly, "you just made the biggest mistake of your young life, the artifact of this encounter, that moment of suspended time before consequences, unfolded, would mark the beginning of a transformation neither man could yet imagine. In the space between Cole's thoughtless cruelty and Brutus's controlled response lay all the difference between wisdom and foolishness, between the law of the gun and the deeper law of respect that governed all lasting relationships. The street had grown utterly silent except for the soft whisper of wind through the buildings and the distant sound of the blacksmith's hammer. Even the children had stopped their play, sensing that something significant was about to unfold in their small corner of the world. The moment stretched like a drawn bowstring, tension building with each second that passed. Cole McGraw's foot was still raised from delivering the kick, his face wearing the smug expression of someone who believed he had just demonstrated his dominance. He had no idea he was standing at the edge of a precipice. Brutus stepped forward, his massive frame moving with the deliberate precision of a predator closing distance. The growl that had begun as a low rumble now deepened, becoming something primal that reached into the most ancient parts of human memory, the sound of death walking on four legs. Cole's expression began to shift from smugness to uncertainty as he finally grasped the magnitude of his error. "I wouldn't move if I were you," Elijah said softly, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man who had faced down grizzly bears and lived to tell about it. "Brutus here has killed 3 bears that were bigger than you and meaner than you. Right now he's deciding whether you're worth the effort." The dog's amber eyes never wavered from Cole's face. Every muscle in his powerful body was coiled and ready, waiting for the signal that would unleash 8 years of training and natural instinct. The scars on his muzzle seemed to stand out more prominently in the morning light, telling their silent story of violence survived and battles won. Cole's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but Elijah's sharp "don't" froze him mid-motion. "Drawing iron will be the last thing you ever do, son. Brutus can clear 6 feet faster than you can clear leather, and he's been trained to go for the throat." The street around them had become a theater, with townspeople watching from windows and doorways. Doc Peterson stood in his office doorway, medical bag in hand, as if he already knew he might be needed. Martha Hendricks peered over the half-doors of her general store, her weathered face grave with concern. Even the children had stopped their play, sensing the deadly seriousness of the moment. "I didn't mean nothing by it," Cole said, his voice higher than it had been moments before. The swagger was gone now, replaced by the dawning realization that he had stumbled into something far more dangerous than he'd anticipated. "Just having a bit of fun with a dog." "Fun," Elijah repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. "You think causing pain to an animal who's done you no harm is fun?" He stepped down from the porch, moving with the careful grace of a man who had spent decades learning to read dangerous situations. "That tells me everything I need to know about your character, boy." Brutus shifted his position slightly, angling himself to cut off Cole's retreat toward his horse. The movement was subtle, but spoke of tactical intelligence that went beyond simple animal instinct. This was a dog who had been trained to hunt the most dangerous game in North America, and those lessons had been learned in blood and survival. "Look, mister," Cole began, but Elijah cut him off with a raised hand. "The name's Elijah Ward, and that dog you just kicked has earned more respect in his 8 years than you have in your 26. Elijah's voice remained calm, but underneath the surface calm was something as immovable as bedrock. "He's pulled me out of snowstorms, warned me of mountain lions, and stood between me and a wounded grizzly that would have torn me apart. What have you done with your life besides steal horses and terrorize honest folk?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a rifle shot. Cole's face reddened, and for a moment it seemed he might say something that would push the situation past the point of no return. Instead, he seemed to recognize something in Elijah's eyes, a hardness that suggested this weathered cowboy had faced down more dangerous men than Cole McGraw and lived to bury them. "I could have my dog tear you apart right here," Elijah continued, his tone conversational despite the deadly content. "Nobody in this town would blame me for it. You're a wanted man, and Brutus was just defending his home from an intruder. Self-defense, plain and simple." Cole's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. The bravado that had carried him through a dozen robberies and countless barroom fights was crumbling in the face of genuine consequence. This wasn't some drunk farmer he could intimidate or some store clerk he could terrorize. This was a man who understood violence in its purest form and wasn't impressed by Cole's reputation. "But I'm not going to do that," Elijah said, and something shifted in his voice. "You know why?" Cole shook his head, not trusting his voice. "Because I see something in you that reminds me of myself at your age. Angry, lost, thinking the world owed you something and taking it by force when it didn't deliver. Elijah's eyes seemed to look through Cole, seeing past the outlaw facade to something deeper. The difference is, I had someone who cared enough to set me straight before I got myself killed. The admission seemed to surprise Cole almost as much as Brutus's threatening posture had. Here was this weathered cowboy, this man who could apparently command a killer dog with a word, admitting to his own past mistakes. It was not what Cole had expected. "I'm going to make you an offer," Elijah continued. "One time only, and it expires the moment you open your mouth to argue with me." He gestured toward Brutus, who remained poised and ready. "You can ride out of here right now and I'll call off my dog. Keep riding until you're out of this territory. And maybe you'll live long enough to see 30. Cole's eyes flickered with hope. But Elijah wasn't finished. "Or you can stay and learn what it means to be a man, instead of just a gun-slinging fool. Learn to earn respect instead of demanding it. Learn that strength comes from what you build, not what you tear down." Elijah's voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "But if you stay, you do things my way. No arguments, no backtalk, and no more cruelty to animals or people. You'll work harder than you ever have in your life, and you'll probably hate every minute of it." The offer hung between them like a bridge across a canyon, a chance for Cole to step away from the path that led inevitably to a violent death in some dusty street or hangman's noose. Around them, the town seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which choice the young outlaw would make. Brutus remained perfectly still, his training evident in the way he held his position without relaxing his vigilance. This was the artifact of the moment, the perfect balance between mercy and justice, between the capacity for violence and the wisdom to withhold it. In the dog's patient readiness lay all the difference between civilization and chaos. Cole looked from the dog to Elijah, then back again. His hand still hovered near his gun, but the gesture now seemed more reflexive than threatening. For the first time in years, he was faced with a choice that couldn't be resolved with violence or theft. Someone was offering him something more valuable than money or reputation. They were offering him a chance to become someone worth respecting. The morning sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows as the moment of decision approached. In the silence, the sound of the blacksmith's hammer seemed unnaturally loud, marking time like a countdown toward whatever future Cole would choose for himself. Cole McGraw stood frozen in that moment of choice for what felt like an eternity. Though it couldn't have been more than 30 seconds. His entire life had been built on quick decisions: draw fast, shoot straight, ride hard, and never look back. But this decision demanded something different, something he wasn't sure he possessed: the courage to admit he might be wrong. "I stay," he said finally, the words coming out rougher than he'd intended. "But I want it on record that I ain't done nothing to deserve." "Stop right there," Elijah interrupted, his voice sharp as a whip crack. "First lesson starts now. When a man offers you salvation, you don't argue with the terms. You say thank you and mean it." Cole's jaw worked silently for a moment, pride warring with the practical knowledge that this man held his life in his hands. Around them, the townspeople continued to watch, their faces showing various degrees of skepticism and curiosity. Finally, Cole managed to force out the words, "Thank you." "That's a start," Elijah said, though his tone suggested it was barely adequate. He made a subtle gesture, and Brutus immediately relaxed his attack posture, though his amber eyes remained fixed on Cole. "Now, first thing we need to address is that horse of yours." Cole's hand moved protectively toward the stallion's reins. "What about my horse?" "That's not your horse," Elijah said matter-of-factly. "That's somebody else's horse that you stole. Beautiful animal. Probably worth 3 months' honest wages to whoever you took him from." He walked over to examine the stallion more closely, running experienced hands along the animal's neck and legs. "Arabian bloodline, expensive tack, well-trained. This horse belongs to someone who cared enough to invest in quality." The stallion responded to Elijah's touch with an ease that made Cole's cheeks burn with embarrassment. Even the horse seemed to recognize the difference between a true horseman and someone who simply used animals as tools. "We'll stable him at Peterson's place for now," Elijah continued. Doc's got good facilities, and he's discreet about asking questions. Tomorrow, you'll help me track down the rightful owner and return him. That's my transportation, Cole protested. How am I supposed to? You're not going anywhere for a while, Elijah cut him off. And when you do travel again, it'll be on a horse you've earned honestly. He gestured toward his own cabin. For now, you'll be staying in my barn. It's clean, dry, and more comfortable than most jail cells. Cole followed Elijah's gaze to the weathered barn behind the cabin, his expression growing more sullen with each passing moment. This wasn't how he'd imagined the conversation going. In his experience, men made offers like Elijah's and then tried to soften the terms when the reality set in. But there was nothing soft about this weathered cowboy. What exactly am I supposed to do here? Cole asked as they walked toward the barn, Brutus padding silently alongside them. I'm not much for farming or whatever it is you do. Right now, you're going to learn how to properly care for animals, Elijah replied, sliding open the barn door to reveal a neat, well-organized space. Bales were stacked with military precision, tools hung from designated hooks, and everything spoke of a man who believed that taking care of his possessions was a reflection of his character. The barn held 2 stalls, one currently empty, the other occupied by Thunder, who nickered softly at their approach. The old quarter horse's coat gleamed despite his age, evidence of careful daily grooming. A small tack room contained saddles, bridles, and other equipment. All clean and well-maintained. This will be your room, Elijah said, indicating a corner of the barn where a simple cot had been set up next to a wooden crate that served as a table. A clean blanket was folded at the foot of the cot, and a small oil lamp sat on the crate alongside a basin and pitcher for washing. Cole examined his new quarters with barely concealed disdain. He'd slept in worse places, but not by choice. How long exactly is this arrangement supposed to last? Until you've learned what you need to learn, Elijah replied. Could be months, could be years. Depends on how quick you are to understand that respect isn't something you can take by force. The artifact that would define this new phase of Cole's life sat unnoticed in the corner, a simple wooden bucket, scarred by years of use. It would become the symbol of his transformation, filled with water for washing horses, feed for animals, and eventually with the honest sweat of hard work. Right now, it was just another piece of barn equipment, but it would soon become the measure of Cole's willingness to change. First job, Elijah continued, is to clean out Thunder's stall. You'll find a pitchfork over there, and the wheelbarrows by the door. I want that stall cleaned, fresh straw laid down, and his water bucket filled from the well. Cole stared at the pitchfork as if it were a foreign object. I've never... Then it's time you learned. Elijah's tone brooked no argument. Brutus and I will be back in an hour to check your work. And Cole? He paused at the barn door. That dog of mine has a memory like an elephant and a sense of justice like a hanging judge. Treat Thunder the way you treated Brutus earlier, and you'll find out just how much patience I'm really willing to extend. With that, man and dog left Cole alone in the barn with Thunder and his thoughts. The old horse watched him with curious brown eyes, as if wondering what this strange new human might bring to his orderly world. Cole picked up the pitchfork with reluctant hands, testing its weight and balance. The tool felt awkward and unfamiliar compared to the comfortable weight of his Colt 45. He approached Thunder's stall cautiously, unsure how the horse might react to his presence. Thunder snorted softly and moved aside as Cole entered the stall, displaying the kind of patient tolerance that comes from years of good treatment. The horse's acceptance somehow made Cole feel worse about his situation rather than better. Even this old animal had more dignity than he'd shown that morning. The work was harder than he'd anticipated. The soiled straw was heavy, and the wheelbarrow seemed determined to tip over whenever he tried to maneuver it. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, despite the morning coolness, and his soft hands quickly developed blisters from the unfamiliar grip of the pitchfork. As he worked, Cole found himself thinking about Elijah's words. The offer of redemption should have felt like a gift, but instead it felt like a burden. He'd spent so many years defining himself by what he could take that the idea of earning something through honest work seemed almost foreign. Thunder watched the proceedings with patient interest, occasionally moving to accommodate Cole's clumsy efforts. The horse's gentle nature stood in stark contrast to the stolen stallion's nervous energy, and Cole began to understand why Elijah had been so insistent about returning the Arabian. By the time Elijah and Brutus returned, Cole had managed to clean the stall and lay down fresh straw, though his technique left much to be desired. Sweat stained his shirt, and his hands were beginning to blister, but the work was done. "Not bad for a first attempt," Elijah said, examining the stall with a critical eye. "Tomorrow we'll work on your technique. For now, get cleaned up and come to the cabin. We need to discuss the rules you'll be living under." As Cole walked toward the cabin, he caught sight of his reflection in the water trough, disheveled, sweaty, and somehow smaller than he remembered. The transformation had already begun, though he didn't yet realize it. The rules, as Elijah laid them out over a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, were as unforgiving as the desert sun. Cole sat across from the weathered cowboy at a rough-hewn table, his blistered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that was stronger than anything he'd tasted outside of a mining camp. "First rule," Elijah said, cutting his cornbread with deliberate precision, "is that you earn everything you get. Food, shelter, respect, none of it comes free. You work for your keep, and if you don't work, you don't eat." Cole nodded, though the concept of truly earning his way was still foreign to him. He'd spent so many years taking what he needed that the idea of working for it seemed unnecessarily complicated. Second rule, no drinking, no gambling, no carousing. This isn't a vacation from your old life, it's a replacement for it. Elijah's steel-grey eyes fixed on Cole's face. "I catch you with so much as a drop of whiskey on your breath, and our arrangement is over. What about—" Cole started to protest, but Elijah held up a hand. "Third rule, no interrupting. When I'm talking, you listen. When you have something to say, you ask permission to speak." The older man's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Respect starts with simple courtesies, and courtesy starts with keeping your mouth shut until it's your turn." Cole's jaw clenched, but he managed to nod his understanding. Every instinct told him to push back, to assert his independence, but the memory of Brutus's amber eyes kept him silent. "Fourth rule," Elijah continued, "is about honesty. No lies, no half-truths, no stories designed to make yourself look better. I've lived too long and seen too much to be fooled by a smooth talker." He paused to take a sip of coffee. "You lied to me once and I'll know it. You lied to me twice, and you'll be explaining yourself to Sheriff Morrison." The mention of the sheriff made Cole shift uncomfortably in his chair. He'd noticed the lawman earlier, a tall, lean man with prematurely grey hair, and the kind of steady gaze that suggested he didn't miss much. Morrison had watched Cole's arrival with professional interest, but hadn't approached. A courtesy extended to Elijah, no doubt. "The most important rule," Elijah said, setting down his coffee cup with a soft clink, "is about respect. You'll show proper respect to every person and animal in this town. That means taking off your hat when you speak to a lady, saying please and thank you when appropriate, and understanding that your reputation means nothing here. You start fresh, and you build your character from the ground up." Cole found his voice, though he tried to keep the resentment out of it. "May I ask how long these rules apply?" "For as long as you're under my roof," Elijah replied. "And if you're smart, for the rest of your life after that." He leaned back in his chair, studying Cole with the patience of someone who had broken wild horses and knew that the process couldn't be rushed. The evening that followed established what would become their routine. After dinner, Elijah led Cole through the proper care of the animals, showing him how to brush Thunder's coat until it gleamed, how to check the horse's hooves for stones or injury, and how to measure out the correct portions of feed and hay. Brutus accompanied them throughout the process, watching Cole's every move with alert intelligence. The dog's presence served as a constant reminder of the morning's events and the consequences of thoughtless cruelty. Gradually, though, Cole began to sense that the animal's watchfulness wasn't entirely hostile. There was an evaluative quality to it, as if Brutus were waiting to see what kind of man Cole might become. The barn became Cole's world as the days passed. He learned the rhythm of morning chores, mucking out stalls, filling water troughs, and ensuring that Thunder had everything needed for comfort and health. The work was harder than anything he'd done since childhood, and his hands developed a collection of blisters that eventually hardened into calluses. Elijah proved to be a demanding teacher, correcting Cole's technique with the same patience he might show a child, but never allowing sloppy work to pass without comment. The old cowboy seemed to have eyes in the back of his head, appearing whenever Cole was tempted to cut corners or rush through a task. A man's character, Elijah said one morning as he watched Cole struggle with the proper way to oil a saddle, is revealed in how he treats the things that can't fight back. Animals, tools, the land itself, they all depend on human care to thrive. The artifact that began to shape Cole's understanding was an old horseshoe hanging on a nail near Thunder's stall. Elijah had found it years ago, a piece of iron worn smooth by countless miles of honest travel. Unlike the quick fixes and stolen shortcuts that had defined Cole's life, the horseshoe represented endurance, utility, and the kind of patient craftsmanship that built lasting value. That shoe probably walked 1,000 miles, Elijah explained when he caught Cole examining it. Fed families, carried messages, brought help when it was needed. Simple piece of iron, but it earned its keep every single day. Cole began to understand that everything in Elijah's world had a purpose and a history. The tools weren't just implements. They were partners in the daily work of building something meaningful. The animals weren't just livestock. They were companions who had earned their place through loyalty and service. The transformation wasn't easy or comfortable. Cole found himself longing for the excitement of his old life, even as he began to appreciate the quiet satisfaction of work well done. His hands grew stronger, his back straightened from the constant bending and lifting, and his reflexes adapted to the rhythms of agricultural life rather than the split-second decisions of gunfighting. But the mental adjustment proved more challenging than the physical one. He'd spent so many years defining himself by what he could take that learning to find pride in what he could give required a fundamental shift in thinking. Some mornings, he woke up planning to saddle Thunder and ride away from this strange new existence. But the memory of Elijah's steady voice and Brutus's patient eyes always held him back. 3 weeks into his stay, Cole made his first real mistake. Frustrated by the endless repetition of chores and the constant supervision, he decided to prove his competence by attempting to shoe Thunder without supervision. The result was a near disaster that left the old horse limping and Cole nursing a bruised ego along with a kicked shoulder. Elijah's reaction was surprisingly mild, disappointment rather than anger, which somehow felt worse than a shouting match would have been. Pride's the last thing to die in a man, the old cowboy observed as Doc Peterson examined Thunder's hoof. And sometimes it has to die hard before real growth can begin. The words stung because they were true, and truth was becoming harder for Cole to avoid. In this place where pretense seemed to wither under the weight of honest work and simple expectations, the 4th week brought an unexpected test in the form of Samuel Morrison, sheriff of Redstone Ridge, arriving at dawn with questions that couldn't be ignored. Cole was in the middle of his morning routine when he heard the distinctive jingle of spurs and the measured cadence of boots that belonged to a man accustomed to authority. "Elijah," Sheriff Morrison called out, his voice carrying the professional courtesy of old friendship mixed with official business. "Got word from over Millerville Way. Seems someone matching young Cole's description robbed the cattleman's bank 3 weeks back." Cole's hands stilled on the curry brush he'd been using on Thunder's coat. Through the barn's open door, he could see Morrison standing beside his bay gelding, hat in hand, as he spoke to Elijah on the cabin porch. Brutus sat at attention beside his master, reading the tension in the air with animal sensitivity. "Is that so?" Elijah's voice remained level, giving nothing away. "What kind of description are we talking about?" Dark hair, medium build, early 20s, riding a black Arabian stallion, Morrison replied. Witnesses say he was polite about it, apologized to the teller, helped an old woman pick up her packages on the way out. Strange behavior for a bank robber. Cole felt his stomach drop. He remembered that job. Remembered the elderly woman whose packages had scattered when she'd stumbled in surprise. He'd helped her gather them without thinking, a reflexive courtesy that had apparently cost him his anonymity. Sounds like half the young men in this territory, Elijah observed. Any other details? Morrison shifted his weight, and Cole could hear the careful selection of words that followed. Well, there's the matter of the horse. Expensive animal like that Arabian, there's not many of them in these parts. And the bank manager mentioned something about a distinctive gun belt, tooled leather with silver conchos. Cole's hand moved unconsciously to his hip, where that very gun belt had hung for 3 years. He'd commissioned it in Santa Fe with money from his first successful robbery, thinking it made him look professional. Now it seemed like a noose around his neck. Sam, Elijah said after a long pause, you know me to be a man of my word. I do. And you know I wouldn't harbor a wanted criminal without good reason. I know that too. Then I'm asking you to trust my judgment on this matter. Give me until the end of the month. If I can't produce something that satisfies your sense of justice by then, you can do whatever your duty requires. Cole held his breath, waiting for Morrison's response. The sheriff was quiet for so long that Cole began to wonder if he'd heard the conversation correctly. Finally, Morrison spoke again. The stolen horse has been returned to its rightful owner, the sheriff said carefully. Anonymous tip led us right to it, along with enough money to cover the bank's losses, and then some. Seems like maybe this particular robber might be having second thoughts about his career choices. That's interesting news, Elijah replied, though Cole detected a note of satisfaction in his voice. Indeed it is. Makes a man wonder if certain problems might have a way of solving themselves, given proper motivation and guidance. Morrison's spurs jingled as he prepared to remount. I'll be back in 2 weeks, Elijah. I hope you know what you're doing. So do I, Sam. So do I. Cole emerged from the barn after Morrison's departure, his face burning with shame and confusion. He found Elijah sitting on the porch steps, methodically cleaning his rifle, not in preparation for trouble, but with the meditative care of someone who found peace in simple, repetitive tasks. You knew, Cole said, the words coming out as half-statement. Half-question, I suspected, Elijah replied, without looking up from his work. Your description's been circulating for weeks, and that gun belt of yours isn't exactly subtle. He ran the cleaning rod through the rifle barrel with practiced efficiency. What I didn't know was whether you had the sense to realize you were standing at a crossroads. Cole sat down heavily on the porch step below Elijah, his legs suddenly unsteady. You paid back the bank. Money's just money, Elijah said with a shrug. A man's character is worth more than any amount of gold. He looked directly at Cole, for the first time since Morrison's visit. Question is, what are you planning to do with this second chance? The artifact that would define this moment was Elijah's rifle, clean, well-maintained and utterly peaceful, in the hands of a man who understood the difference between being armed and being dangerous. It represented the kind of quiet strength that didn't need to prove itself through violence, the kind of power that came from self-control rather than domination. I don't understand you, Cole said finally. You could have turned me in, collected the reward, and been done with it. Why risk your reputation for someone you barely know? Elijah set down his rifle and leaned back against the porch post. You ever hear of a man named William Clark? Cole shook his head. He was a cavalry sergeant about 20 years back. Found me half dead in a snowstorm, delirious with fever, and wanted by the army for desertion. Elijah's eyes took on the distant look of someone revisiting old memories. Could have left me to die, probably should have, given that helping a deserter was a court-martial offense. What did he do? Nursed me back to health, gave me food and shelter, and then asked me the same question I'm asking you. What was I planning to do with my life? Elijah's voice grew quiet. Turns out I wasn't really a deserter. I'd been separated from my unit during a battle and reported dead. But Clark didn't know that when he helped me. Cole waited for the rest of the story. Sensing there was more, he told me that every man deserves one chance to choose who he wants to be, regardless of who he's been up to that point. Said the measure of a person isn't in their mistakes, but in what they do after they recognize those mistakes. Elijah picked up his rifle again, checking the action with automatic precision. I've spent the last 30 years trying to be worthy of that faith he showed in me. The weight of that revelation settled over Cole like a blanket. Here was a man who had faced his own moment of judgment and found someone willing to believe in his capacity for change. The parallel was unmistakable, and it made Elijah's offer feel less like charity and more like a sacred trust. "What if I fail?" Cole asked. "What if I can't become the kind of man you think I can be?" "Then you fail," Elijah said simply. "But you'll fail while trying to build something instead of trying to tear it down. There's honor in that kind of failure, and there's no honor at all in never making the attempt." That afternoon, Cole threw himself into his work with a new intensity. The chores that had seemed like punishment began to feel like preparation, each task building toward something larger than himself. He found himself paying attention to details he'd previously overlooked, the way Thunder's ears pricked forward when he heard Cole's footsteps, the satisfaction of seeing tools properly cleaned and stored, the simple pleasure of work done thoroughly rather than hastily. Brutus had begun following him during the afternoon chores, no longer as a guard, but as a companion. The dog's presence felt like acceptance, though Cole knew it was provisional and could be revoked if he proved unworthy of the trust being placed in him. As evening approached, Cole stood in the barn doorway watching Elijah repair a section of fence that had been damaged by wind. The older man worked with unhurried efficiency, each movement economical and purposeful. There was a kind of poetry in his competence, a demonstration of what could be accomplished when skill was married to patience and dedication. For the first time since arriving in Redstone Ridge, Cole began to believe that transformation might actually be possible. The 6th week brought a drought that tested everyone's patience and resources. The well behind Elijah's cabin dropped 2 feet, forcing them to ration water for both human and animal needs. What had been routine chores became exercises in conservation and careful planning, and Cole discovered that hardship had a way of revealing character that comfort could never expose. He stood at the well pump in the pre-dawn darkness, working the handle with steady rhythm while Brutus sat nearby, both of them listening to the increasingly labored sound of water being drawn from deeper and deeper in the earth. Each stroke required more effort than the last, and Cole's shoulders burned from the repetitive motion. But he'd learned that complaining accomplished nothing except revealing weakness. "Water's getting scarce," Elijah observed, emerging from the cabin with 2 cups of coffee that had been stretched thin with chicory. "We'll need to make some hard choices about priorities." Cole accepted the coffee gratefully, though it tasted more like colored water than the robust brew he'd grown accustomed to. "What kind of choices?" "Animals come first," Elijah said without hesitation. "Thunder and Brutus depend on us completely. After that, we conserve what we can for drinking and cooking. Everything else, washing, cleaning, convenience, comes last." The arithmetic of survival was simple and unforgiving, and Cole found himself adapting to it with surprising ease. He learned to shave with a cup of water instead of a basin, to wash dishes with sand before using precious water for rinsing, and to appreciate the value of every drop that passed through their small domain. Martha Hendricks arrived that afternoon with news that made the water shortage seem like a minor inconvenience. She rode up to the cabin on her old mare, her usually composed face tight with worry, and dismounted with the careful movements of someone carrying bad news. "Elijah," she called out, "we need to talk. Privately." Cole was mending a bridle in the barn doorway when Martha arrived. Close enough to overhear, but far enough away to maintain the pretense of not listening. Brutus, however, had no such social constraints, and padded over to greet Martha with the tail-wagging enthusiasm he reserved for trusted friends. "What's troubling you, Martha?" Elijah asked, gesturing toward the porch chairs. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Worse than that, Martha replied, settling into the offered chair with a sigh. I've seen Jacob Morrison's nephew, and he's asking questions about your house guest. Cole's hands stilled on the leather he'd been stitching. Jacob Morrison was Sheriff Morrison's brother, a bitter man who'd never recovered from losing his ranch to foreclosure 5 years earlier. He blamed everyone except himself for his misfortunes and had developed a reputation for stirring up trouble wherever he could find it. What kind of questions? Elijah's voice remained calm, but Cole could detect the edge of concern underneath. The dangerous kind, Martha said. He's been in the Silver Dollar for 3 days running, buying drinks for anyone willing to listen to his theories about how certain law-abiding citizens might be harboring wanted criminals. He's got people talking, Elijah, and not in a good way. Cole felt his stomach tighten. He'd known this day would come eventually. The past had a way of catching up with men like him, no matter how far they ran or how hard they tried to change. The question was whether his transformation had progressed far enough to survive the scrutiny. How much does he know? Elijah asked. Enough to be dangerous, not enough to be certain, Martha replied. He's got the basic description, and he's noticed that the timing of Cole's arrival matches up with when the robberies stopped. But it's all speculation so far, Elijah nodded thoughtfully. Speculation can be as dangerous as facts when it comes from the right mouth. The artifact that would define this crisis was a simple thing. A wanted poster that Martha produced from her coat pocket. Creased and worn from handling, Cole's face stared back from the crude sketch, younger and harder than he appeared now, but recognizable enough to cause problems for anyone willing to look closely. $500, Martha said, reading from the poster. That's enough money to make even honest men think twice about minding their own business. Cole emerged from the barn, drawn by a combination of curiosity and the knowledge that his fate was being discussed, whether he participated or not. Both Martha and Elijah looked up as he approached, their expressions grave but not hostile. I heard my name, Cole said simply. Figure I ought to be part of this conversation. Martha studied him with the calculating gaze of someone who had raised 5 children and buried 2 husbands. You've changed, she said finally. Lost that hunted look you had when you first rode into town. Standing straighter, too, like you're not carrying quite so much weight on your shoulders. That doesn't change what I was, Cole replied. Or what people will think when they find out. No, Martha agreed, but it might change what you become. Question is, are you planning to run again, or are you finally ready to stop running? Cole looked from Martha to Elijah, seeing in their faces the kind of acceptance he'd never experienced before. These people knew exactly who he was and what he'd done, yet they were willing to stand with him against whatever consequences might come. It was a gift more valuable than any amount of stolen money. I'm done running, he said, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. Whatever happens, I'll face it here. Elijah smiled, the first genuinely pleased expression Cole had seen on the older man's weathered features. Then we'd better start preparing for what's coming. Jacob Morrison isn't the type to let something like this drop, especially when there's money involved. They spent the rest of the afternoon planning. Martha would spread word through her network of friends and customers that Cole had been working steadily and honestly, earning his keep through labor rather than theft. Doc Peterson, who had been treating Thunder's injured hoof, would testify to Cole's character and the genuine changes he'd shown. Even the children who played in the street had noticed Cole's patient way with animals and his willingness to help with small tasks around town. But perhaps most importantly, Sheriff Morrison would need to make a decision about where his loyalties lay, with his duty to enforce the law as written, or with his friendship for Elijah and his growing respect for what Cole was trying to become. Change is never easy, Martha observed as she prepared to leave. But it's especially hard when you're trying to outrun your own shadow. The trick is to stop running long enough to let the light catch up with you. As evening fell, Cole found himself sitting on the porch with Elijah and Brutus, watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. The drought had at least given them this gift, air so clean and dry that the stars seemed close enough to touch. "You afraid?" Elijah asked quietly. "Terrified," Cole admitted, "but not of dying. I'm afraid of going back to being the man I was before I came here." "That man's already dead," Elijah said with quiet conviction. "Question now is whether you're ready to let everyone else see who you've become." Cole reached down to scratch behind Brutus's ears, marveling at how the dog that had once threatened to tear out his throat now leaned into his touch with complete trust. It was a small miracle, but it gave him hope that larger miracles might still be possible. The truth arrived on a Tuesday morning in the form of a telegram that would rewrite everything Cole thought he knew about his past. Doc Peterson delivered it personally, riding out from town with the grim expression of a man carrying news that couldn't be softened by careful delivery. "Wire came in on the morning train," Doc said, dismounting from his buggy with the careful movements of a man whose joints protested the early morning chill. "Addressed to Cole McGraw, care of Elijah Ward. Figured it was important enough to bring out right away." Cole accepted the yellow telegraph paper with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from anticipation or dread he couldn't say. The message was brief, typed in the impersonal block letters that made even the most personal communication feel like a business transaction. "Urgent stop. Your father, Jack McGraw, died yesterday. Stop left. Confession absolving you. Stop robbery. Charges dropped. Stop. Please come home. Stop. Signed, William Carson. Attorney stop." The words swam before Cole's eyes as he read them once, twice, then a third time, unable to process the implications of what he was seeing. His father dead. The charges dropped. Everything he'd believed about his situation had just been turned upside down. "Son." Elijah's voice seemed to come from very far away. "What does it say?" Cole handed over the telegram with numb fingers, his mind reeling as he tried to reconcile this new reality with everything he'd assumed about his life. Jack McGraw had been many things: a drunk, a gambler, a man who'd never met a scheme he wouldn't try, but Cole had never imagined him capable of the kind of systematic theft that had put a price on his son's head. Elijah read the telegram twice before, looking up with an expression of profound sadness, mixed with understanding. "How long have you been running from crimes you didn't commit?" 3 years, Cole said, his voice hollow. 3 years of looking over my shoulder, sleeping with one eye open, never staying in one place long enough to call it home." He sat down heavily on the porch steps, suddenly feeling exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor. Doc Peterson cleared his throat diplomatically. "There's more." The sheriff received a longer telegram with details. "Seems your father left a detailed confession, along with evidence of where the real money went. Bank records, receipts, even correspondence with his partners. The attorney says it's ironclad, enough to clear your name completely. The artifact that would symbolize this moment was the telegram itself, a thin piece of yellow paper that weighed no more than a feather, but carried enough truth to reshape a man's entire existence. Cole stared at it as if it were a snake that might bite him, unable to fully comprehend that his 3-year nightmare was finally over. "All this time," Cole said slowly, "I've been running from something I didn't do, stealing to survive because I thought I was already damned, living like an outlaw because I believed that's what I was." "But you're not an outlaw," Elijah said gently. "You never were. You're a young man who got caught up in someone else's mistakes and made some poor choices as a result." "Poor choices." Cole laughed bitterly. "I robbed banks, Elijah. I held guns on innocent people and took their money. The fact that I was innocent of the original charges doesn't change what I became afterward." Doc Peterson shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing that he was witnessing something too personal for casual observation. "I should get back to town," he said, preparing to remount his buggy. "Let you folks sort this out in private." After Doc's departure, an uncomfortable silence settled over the cabin. Brutus sensed the tension and moved closer to Elijah, his amber eyes alert and watchful. Even the dog seemed to understand that something fundamental had shifted in their small world. "What are you thinking?" Elijah asked finally. I'm thinking that everything I've learned here about work, about respect, about becoming a better man was built on a lie. Cole's voice carried a bitterness that hadn't been there for weeks. I don't actually need redemption because I was never really guilty in the first place. Is that what you believe? Elijah's tone was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. I don't know what to believe anymore. Cole stood up abruptly and began pacing the length of the porch. I could pack up right now and ride out of here a free man. No more hiding, no more looking over my shoulder. I could go back to... He stopped mid-sentence, realizing that he couldn't finish the thought. Go back to what? Elijah prompted. I don't know, Cole admitted. I've been running for so long that I'd forgotten there might be something to go back to. Elijah leaned back in his chair, studying Cole with the patient attention he might give to a horse showing signs of spoking. Let me ask you something. Do you think the banks you robbed care whether you were innocent of the original charges? Do you think the people you terrorized will feel better knowing you had a good reason for holding them at gunpoint? Cole's pacing slowed as the implications of the question sank in. No, he said quietly. I suppose they wouldn't. And what about the man you've become over the past 6 weeks? Does his character depend on whether you were legally guilty or innocent when you arrived here? The question hit Cole like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on the revelation of his innocence that he'd lost sight of everything else, the genuine crimes he had committed, the people he'd hurt, the man he'd chosen to become despite his circumstances. I robbed those banks, he said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. Innocent or not, I made those choices. I hurt those people. Yes, you did, Elijah agreed. And that's what makes your transformation meaningful. Anyone can behave well when they have no choice. It takes character to choose the right path when the wrong one is easier. Cole stopped pacing and turned to face Elijah directly. So what does this change? That depends on you, Elijah replied. You could leave here today legally free and clear. Start over somewhere new with a clean slate and nobody asking questions about your past. He paused, letting the possibility hang in the air. Or you could stay and finish what you started. Make things right with the people you wronged. Become the kind of man who faces his mistakes instead of running from them. The choice lay before Cole like a fork in the road, each path leading to a completely different future. On one side was freedom, the chance to escape his past entirely and begin again with no obligations or consequences. On the other was responsibility, the harder path of acknowledging his wrongs and working to make amends. If I stay, Cole said slowly, what happens to the money I stole? The people I hurt? Then we figure out how to make it right, Elijah said simply. Together. The word together carried a weight that surprised Cole. In all his years of running and hiding, he'd never had someone offer to share the burden of his mistakes. The idea that he didn't have to face the consequences alone was both liberating and terrifying. Why would you do that? Cole asked. You've already done more for me than I had any right to expect, because that's what fathers do, Elijah said quietly. And whether you realize it or not, that's what you've become to me over these past weeks. Not by blood, but by choice. The admission hung between them like a bridge, offering connection where there had been only obligation. Cole felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the defensive barriers he'd built around his heart during years of solitary survival. I want to make things right, he said finally. Not because I have to, but because it's the right thing to do. Elijah smiled, the deep, satisfied expression of a teacher whose student has finally grasped the most important lesson. Then that's what we'll do. One step at a time, one debt at a time, until you can look at yourself in the mirror and like what you see, as if sensing the moment's importance. Brutus rose from his position by Elijah's chair and padded over to Cole, pressing his massive head against the young man's leg in a gesture of acceptance and trust. Cole's hand found the familiar spot behind the dog's ears, and for the first time since receiving the telegram, he felt peace settling over him like a comfortable blanket. The truth had set him free, but not in the way he'd expected. Instead of releasing him from responsibility, it had given him the freedom to choose his own form of justice. The decision to stay and face his past transformed Cole's final week in Redstone Ridge into something resembling a military campaign. He and Elijah spent hours planning how to approach each bank he'd robbed, calculating restitution amounts, and preparing for the legal complexities that would inevitably follow his voluntary surrender. The dining table in Elijah's cabin became a war room, covered with maps, correspondence, and carefully written lists. Cole had compiled a detailed account of every crime he'd committed, dates, locations, amounts stolen, and descriptions of any property damage or personal harm he'd caused. The exercise was excruciating, forcing him to confront the full scope of his crimes without the comfortable distance that time usually provided. Millerville Bank, $347, plus approximately $50 in damage to the front door, Cole read from his notes. His voice steady, despite the weight of the words. No injuries, but the teller, Mrs. Abernathy, fainted and hit her head on the counter. I should find out if she required medical treatment. Elijah nodded, making notes on his own sheet of paper. Doc Peterson knows a physician in Millerville. We can get word about Mrs. Abernathy's condition and see if there were any lasting effects. The methodical approach helped keep Cole's emotions in check, turning overwhelming guilt into manageable tasks. Each item on the list represented a problem to be solved rather than a sin to be carried, and the transformation was both subtle and profound. Brutus had become Cole's constant companion during these planning sessions, lying at his feet with the patient attention of a dog who sensed his human's distress but couldn't understand its source. Sometimes Cole found himself absently stroking the dog's scarred head while dictating another entry in his catalogue of crimes, drawing comfort from the animal's steady presence. The artifact that defined this period was a leather-bound ledger book that Martha Hendricks had provided, the kind used by merchants to track debts and payments. Cole had transformed it into a record of moral accounting, each page documenting not just what he owed in money, but what he owed in acknowledgement, apology, and changed behavior. The hardest part, Cole said one evening as they reviewed his progress, isn't calculating the money. It's knowing that some things can't be repaid. That woman in Millerville who fainted, I can cover her medical bills, but I can't undo the fear I caused her. No, Elijah agreed. You can't, but you can make sure you never cause that kind of fear again. Sometimes that's the only restitution that matters. Word of Cole's decision had spread through Redstone Ridge's tight-knit community with the speed that news travels in small towns. The reaction was mixed. Some townspeople admired his courage in facing his past, while others questioned the wisdom of harboring a confessed criminal. Regardless of his apparent transformation, Jacob Morrison had seized on the revelation like a drowning man grabbing a rope, using it as proof that his suspicions had been correct all along. He'd taken to holding court in the Silver Dollar, buying drinks for anyone willing to listen to his theories about how Cole's so-called redemption was nothing more than an elaborate con game. Mark my words, Jacob declared to anyone who would listen. That boy's just waiting for the right moment to slip away in the night. All this talk about making amends, it's just another way to steal from honest folk, Sheriff Morrison found, himself caught between his brother's accusations and his growing respect for what Cole was attempting to accomplish. The legal situation was complicated. While Cole was now cleared of the original charges that had made him an outlaw, his subsequent crimes were real and required official response. Legally speaking, Sheriff Morrison explained during a tense meeting at Elijah's cabin, I have to arrest him the moment he confesses to a crime in my jurisdiction, but I also have discretion about timing and circumstances. Cole sat across from the sheriff, his hands folded calmly in his lap, despite the magnitude of what they were discussing. What does that mean, practically speaking? It means I can give you time to arrange your affairs and make your restitution plans, but I can't let you walk around indefinitely as a known criminal, Morrison replied. The law has to be respected even when we sympathize with the circumstances. How much time? Elijah asked. 2 weeks, Morrison said after a long pause. That gives you time to contact the other banks, arrange for payments, and put your legal affairs in order. After that, I'll have to place you under arrest and transport you to the territorial court in Boulder Creek." Cole nodded, accepting the timeline without complaint. 2 weeks was more than he'd hoped for, and less than he'd wanted, but it was enough to begin the process of making things right. The most difficult conversation came when Cole decided to write to his father's attorney in Colorado, requesting details about the confession that had cleared his name. The response, when it came, painted a picture of Jack McGraw that was both more complex and more tragic than Cole had imagined. "Your father apparently developed a gambling problem after your mother's death." Cole read from the attorney's letter, his voice thick with emotion. "He embezzled money from the bank where he worked as a bookkeeper, then arranged for the evidence to point toward you when the theft was discovered. He believed you were already lost to him, that you'd run away permanently, and thought he could buy time to replace the money before you were found." Elijah listened in silence, understanding that some revelations required space to be absorbed rather than immediately discussed. He kept detailed records. Cole continued, "Apparently hoping to someday confess and clear my name, but he kept gambling, kept losing, and the debt kept growing until confession became impossible. The lawyer says he died of a heart attack brought on by guilt and stress." The letter explained so much about Cole's past, why the evidence against him had been so convincing, why his father had seemed so distant in the months before Cole's flight, and why no one had believed his protestations of innocence. Jack McGraw had been drowning in his own mistakes and had pulled his son down with him. "I hated him," Cole said quietly. "All these years I hated him for not standing up for me, for not believing in my innocence. And all along he knew I was innocent because he was the one who made me look guilty." "Hate's a heavy burden to carry," Elijah observed, "especially when the person you're hating is already carrying more guilt than any man should bear." Cole folded the letter carefully and placed it in his ledger book. Another debt to be recorded and somehow repaid. "How did you make amends to a dead man who had destroyed both their lives in a misguided attempt to save himself?" The final days before his surrender took on a dreamlike quality. Cole threw himself into his chores with an intensity that bordered on desperation, as if he could somehow complete a lifetime's worth of honest work in the remaining hours. He repaired fences that didn't need repairing, organized tools that were already organized, and spent long hours grooming Thunder until the old horse's coat gleamed like burnished copper. Brutus seemed to sense that something was ending. The dog followed Cole more closely than usual, often pressing against his legs as if to offer comfort or perhaps to anchor him to the present moment. During the long evening hours, Cole found himself talking to the dog about his fears, his regrets, and his hopes for whatever future might await him. "I used to think courage meant not being afraid," Cole said one night as he and Brutus sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. "Now I think maybe courage means being afraid and doing the right thing anyway." The dog's amber eyes reflected the starlight, patient and understanding in the way that only animals could be. Cole scratched behind Brutus's ears, marveling at the trust the animal had learned to place in him despite their violent first encounter. On the final Sunday before his surrender, the community of Redstone Ridge surprised Cole with an unexpected gesture. As he and Elijah returned from their evening chores, they found a small gathering on the cabin's front porch. Doc Peterson, Martha Hendricks, the blacksmith, and even several families with children who had been watching Cole's transformation from a distance. "We wanted to give you something," Martha said, stepping forward with a package wrapped in brown paper. "Something to remember us by, and to remind you that people can change if they want it badly enough." Inside the package was a new hat, not fancy, but well-made and practical, the kind of hat that an honest working man might wear. Attached to the hatband was a small silver pin in the shape of a horseshoe, polished to mirror brightness. "For luck," Doc Peterson explained, "and to remind you that even the hardest metal can be shaped into something useful with enough heat and pressure." Cole accepted the gift with hands that trembled slightly, overwhelmed by the kindness of people who had every reason to shun him, but had chosen instead to support his efforts at redemption. The hat fit perfectly, and the weight of it on his head felt like a blessing rather than a burden. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "All of you. You've given me something I didn't know I was looking for." "What's that?" Martha asked. "A reason to believe that tomorrow can be better than yesterday," Cole replied. "No matter what happens next, I'll carry that with me." As the townspeople dispersed into the gathering darkness, Cole stood on the porch wearing his new hat and feeling the weight of their faith in his transformation. Tomorrow would bring Sheriff Morrison and the formal beginning of his legal reckoning. But tonight he was surrounded by people who believed in his capacity for change. It was more than he'd ever dared to hope for, and it would have to be enough to sustain him through whatever trials lay ahead. Sheriff Morrison arrived at dawn on the appointed day, accompanied by 2 deputies and wearing the grim expression of a man performing a duty he wished he could avoid. Cole was ready for him, standing on the cabin porch in his new hat, with his hands clearly visible and his gun belt already removed and hanging from a porch post. "Cole McGraw," Sheriff Morrison said formally, his voice carrying across the yard with official authority. "I'm placing you under arrest for robbery in the 1st degree, multiple counts. You have the right to remain silent." "I waive that right," Cole interrupted gently. "I want to make a full confession." The sheriff paused in his recitation, clearly not expecting such immediate cooperation. Most men facing multiple felony charges at least attempted to negotiate or delay the inevitable. Cole's calm acceptance of his fate seemed to unsettle everyone present except Elijah, who stood beside him with quiet pride. "That's your choice," Morrison said, "but I'd advise you to wait until you have legal representation." "I appreciate the advice, Sheriff, but I've been practicing this speech for 2 weeks, Cole replied. "I'd rather get it said while I still have the courage." One of the deputies, a young man Cole didn't recognize, stepped forward with iron shackles, but Morrison waved him back with a subtle gesture. There was something in Cole's demeanor that suggested restraints would be unnecessary, a quality of resigned dignity that spoke of genuine acceptance rather than calculated performance. "Go ahead then," Morrison said, "but understand that anything you say will be used in court." Cole nodded and began to speak, his voice steady and clear in the morning air. He recited the contents of his ledger from memory, dates, locations, amounts, and circumstances of each crime he'd committed. The confession took nearly 20 minutes, delivered without excuse or justification, simply a factual accounting of wrongs done and debts owed. The artifact that would define this moment was Cole's removed gun belt, hanging empty on the porch post like a shed skin. It represented not just the surrender of weapons, but the abandonment of the violent identity that had defined him for 3 years. The leather was worn smooth by use, the holster shaped by the weight of the Colt that had been his constant companion through countless dangerous situations. "I calculate the total amount stolen at 1,847, Cole concluded. "I've prepared restitution payments totaling $2,200 to account for interest and inconvenience. The money is in the First National Bank of Redstone Ridge, held in trust pending resolution of these charges." Sheriff Morrison had been taking notes throughout the confession, his expression growing more thoughtful with each detail. This was clearly not what he'd expected. Most criminals either denied everything or tried to minimize their crimes. Cole's meticulous honesty was almost unprecedented in Morrison's experience. "Where did you get the money for restitution?" Morrison asked when Cole finished. "I earned it," Cole replied simply. "Honest work, fair wages, saved every penny for 6 weeks." From the cabin porch, Elijah stepped forward. "I can vouch for that, Sam. The boys worked harder than any man I've ever hired, earned every cent through sweat and dedication." The unexpected voice that interrupted the proceedings belonged to Jacob Morrison, who came riding up from town with the aggressive posture of a man spoiling for confrontation. He dismounted from his horse with theatrical flair, clearly expecting to play a starring role in whatever drama was unfolding. "Well, well," Jacob called out, his voice carrying the satisfaction of vindicated suspicion. "Finally caught up with you, didn't we, boy? All that talk about redemption and working for your keep, I knew it was just a matter of time before the law caught up with your crimes." Cole turned to face Jacob with the calm attention he might give to an irritating but harmless insect. "You're right, Mr. Morrison. The law has caught up with me. That's why I'm here confessing to Sheriff Morrison instead of running away." "Confessing?" Jacob's face showed confusion rather than triumph. "What kind of trick is this?" "No trick," Sheriff Morrison said curtly. "Mr. McGraw is voluntarily surrendering himself and making full restitution for his crimes. It's called taking responsibility. Something you might try sometime, Jacob." The rebuke clearly stung, and Jacob's face reddened with anger and embarrassment. "You can't seriously believe this outlaw's sob story about redemption. He's a criminal, Sam. Criminals don't just decide to become honest men because some old cowboy gives them a few chores." "Maybe not," Sheriff Morrison replied, "but this one seems to have managed it." Cole found himself stepping between the two brothers, sensing that their conflict had roots deeper than his own situation. "Sheriff Morrison is doing his duty, Mr. Jacob. I broke the law, and now I'm facing the consequences. That's how justice is supposed to work." Jacob's response was immediate and vicious. "Justice? You think hiding out here playing cowboy for a few weeks makes up for terrorizing innocent people? You think a few dollars makes everything right?" "No, sir, I don't," Cole said quietly. "Nothing I do can undo the fear I caused or the harm I've done, but I can make sure I never cause that kind of harm again, and I can try to pay back what I took. It's not perfect justice, but it's all I have to offer." The simple honesty of the response seemed to deflate Jacob's anger, leaving him looking confused and somehow smaller. He'd clearly expected defiance or excuses, something he could argue against. Cole's acceptance of guilt and responsibility left him with nothing to attack. "Time to go," Sheriff Morrison said, though his tone was gentler than it had been at the beginning of the arrest. "The territorial judge in Boulder Creek will want to hear your case as soon as possible." Cole nodded and turned to say goodbye to Elijah, but the older man surprised him by pulling him into a brief, fierce embrace. "I'm proud of you, son," Elijah whispered. "Remember that, whatever happens next." Brutus padded over to Cole and pressed his massive head against the young man's leg one final time, amber eyes reflecting something that looked remarkably like understanding. Cole knelt down and scratched behind the dog's ears, marveling at how much had changed since that first violent encounter. "Take care of him," Cole said to Elijah, "and thank you for teaching me the difference between being a man and being a gun." As Sheriff Morrison's party prepared to depart, Cole took one last look at the cabin that had become his salvation. The morning sun painted the rough wooden walls in shades of gold and amber, making the simple structure look almost majestic in the clear desert light. He was no longer the same man who had kicked a dog in a moment of thoughtless cruelty. Whether that transformation would be enough to save him remained to be seen, but he was finally ready to face whatever judgment awaited him. The territorial courthouse in Boulder Creek was the imposing stone building that had witnessed more than its share of frontier justice, but Judge Harrison Blackwood had never encountered a case quite like Cole McGraw's. As Cole stood before the bench 3 days later, flanked by a court-appointed attorney who seemed more confused than helpful, the judge studied the file with the thorough attention of a man who understood that precedent was being set. "Mr. McGraw," Judge Blackwood said, in a voice that carried the authority of 3 decades on the bench, "I have before me a confession to multiple felonies, complete financial restitution, and what appears to be the most unusual collection of character witnesses I've seen in my career." Cole remained standing at attention, his new hat held respectfully in his hands. Word of his voluntary surrender had somehow reached Boulder Creek ahead of the official transport, and the courtroom was filled with curious onlookers who had come to witness this strange reversal of the usual criminal proceedings. Your Honor, Cole's attorney began, but Judge Blackwood silenced him with a raised hand. I'll hear from Mr. McGraw first, the judge said. This is his confession, and these are his crimes. I want to understand what prompted such an extraordinary demonstration of accountability. Cole cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice carrying clearly through the crowded courtroom. He told the story of his transformation, not as an excuse for his crimes, but as an explanation for his decision to face them. He spoke of Elijah's patience, Brutus's forgiveness, and the community of Redstone Ridge that had shown him what it meant to earn respect rather than demand it. I can't undo what I did, Cole concluded, but I can make sure I never do it again. I'm not asking for mercy, Your Honor. I'm asking for the chance to prove that people can change if they're given the right guidance and support. Judge Blackwood listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on the papers before him. When Cole finished speaking, the judge called for the prosecution to present their case, but District Attorney Morrison, no relation to the sheriff, seemed almost reluctant to proceed with normal criminal charges. Your Honor, the prosecutor said, this case presents unusual circumstances. The defendant has made full restitution, voluntarily surrendered himself, and demonstrated genuine remorse for his actions. While the law requires consequences for criminal behavior, it also allows for consideration of mitigating circumstances. The artifact that would determine Cole's fate was a leather portfolio containing letters from the victims of his crimes, testimonials that Sheriff Morrison had helped Cole collect during the weeks leading up to his trial. Mrs. Abernathy from Millerville had written that Cole's personal letter of apology and payment for her medical expenses had meant more to her than any legal punishment could provide. What the young man gave me, her letter read, was the knowledge that he understood the harm he'd caused and was genuinely sorry for it. That's worth more than any amount of time in prison. Similar letters from other victims painted a picture of a criminal who had done something unprecedented. He had sought out the people he'd harmed and asked for their forgiveness, not as a legal strategy, but as a moral necessity. Judge Blackwood called for a brief recess to review the materials, during which Cole found himself surrounded by supporters who had made the journey from Redstone Ridge. Elijah sat in the front row, his weathered face calm, but his eyes reflecting deep concern for the outcome. Martha Hendricks had closed her store to attend the trial, and even Doc Peterson had made the long trip to Boulder Creek. When court reconvened, Judge Blackwood's expression had shifted from judicial skepticism to something approaching wonder. In 30 years on this bench, he began, I have never seen a defendant take such comprehensive responsibility for his actions. Mr. McGraw, you have committed serious crimes that ordinarily would result in significant prison time. However, the law also recognizes that justice is not always best served by the most severe punishment available. Cole felt his heart racing but kept his expression neutral, unwilling to show hope that might prove premature. I'm therefore sentencing you to 5 years supervised probation, to be served under the direct supervision of Mr. Elijah Ward in Redstone Ridge, Judge Blackwood continued. You will perform 200 hours of community service annually, maintain steady employment, and submit monthly reports on your activities and finances. Any violation of these terms will result in immediate imprisonment for the full sentence these crimes would normally carry. The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs, but Judge Blackwood wasn't finished. Furthermore, he said, raising his voice above the crowd, this case will be studied and discussed in legal circles for years to come. You have demonstrated that the purpose of justice, which is not punishment, but the prevention of future harm, can sometimes be better served by rehabilitation than incarceration. Cole felt his knees weaken with relief, but managed to remain standing until the judge formally closed the proceedings. As the gavel fell, marking the end of his legal ordeal, he turned to see Elijah rising from his seat with tears in his steel-gray eyes. Thank you, Your Honor, Cole said, his voice thick with emotion. I won't disappoint you. You'd better not, Judge Blackwood replied, with the hint of a smile. Because I'll be watching your progress with great interest. This is your second chance. Mr. McGraw, don't waste it. As Cole walked out of the courthouse, a free man, albeit one bound by the terms of his probation, he felt the weight of the past 3 years finally lifting from his shoulders. The future stretched before him, uncertain but filled with possibility, and for the first time since his father's crimes had changed his life. He was ready to embrace whatever came next. The sun was setting over Boulder Creek as the group from Redstone Ridge prepared for the journey home, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise better days ahead. 2 years later, Cole McGraw stood on the same porch where his transformation had begun, watching the morning sun paint Redstone Ridge in familiar shades of gold and amber. The scars on his hands had long since faded into the weathered calluses of honest work, and the haunted look that had once shadowed his eyes had been replaced by the quiet confidence of a man who had found his place in the world. Brutus lay at his feet, grey-muzzled now, but still alert, still ready to defend his territory against threats both real and imagined. The dog's amber eyes reflected the same intelligence they'd always held, but now they looked at Cole with the absolute trust reserved for family. The transformation from enemy to guardian to friend had been complete for so long that Cole sometimes struggled to remember the fear that had once defined their relationship. "Morning, boy," Cole murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears with the automatic affection of long habit. "Ready for another day?" The routine that followed was as familiar as breathing. Cole pumped water from the well that had been deepened and reinforced during his second summer in Redstone Ridge, fed Thunder in the pasture, where the old horse now spent his retirement alongside 2 younger mares that Cole had purchased with money earned from his expanding horse-training business, and checked the equipment in the barn that had become a workshop for broken animals and broken men seeking redemption. The barn had evolved into something resembling a veterinary clinic, where Cole applied the patient techniques Elijah had taught him to horses and dogs that others had given up on. Word of his gift for gentling traumatized animals had spread throughout the territory, bringing a steady stream of clients and a growing reputation that had nothing to do with his criminal past. The artifact that symbolized his transformation hung on the barn wall, a simple wooden plaque that read Cole McGraw, Animal Rehabilitation, hand-carved by the town's carpenter as a gift for Cole's first anniversary of freedom. Below it hung his old gun belt, now serving as a reminder of who he used to be rather than a tool for who he might become. "You're up early," Elijah observed, emerging from the cabin with 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of a man whose faith had been vindicated by time. At 64, he moved with the careful economy of someone whose joints protested the morning chill, but his eyes remained as sharp as ever. "Couldn't sleep," Cole admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Got word yesterday that Judge Blackwood wants to see me next month. Something about a legal conference where they're discussing my case. Nervous about it." "Some," Cole said. "Feels strange, being held up as an example of something. Most of my life, I was an example of what not to do." Elijah settled into his usual chair, and Brutus immediately repositioned himself to maintain contact with both men. The dog's loyalty had expanded to include Cole completely, though Elijah would always hold the position of pack leader in Brutus's understanding of their small family. "You ever regret staying?" Elijah asked, a question that had become something of a ritual between them. "Ever wonder what might have happened if you'd taken that telegram as permission to run?" Cole considered the question with the same thoughtfulness he brought to all of Elijah's teachings. "Every day for the first year," he said honestly. "Running was all I knew for so long that staying still felt like the hardest thing I'd ever done. But no, I don't regret it. This life," he gestured toward the town, the animals, "the simple evidence of honest work. This is the first time I've ever felt like I belonged somewhere." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. Sheriff Morrison appeared around the bend, riding his familiar bay gelding and wearing the expression of a man bearing news rather than trouble. His monthly visits had evolved from official supervision to friendly social calls, a change that reflected the community's growing acceptance of Cole's transformation. "Morning, gentlemen," Morrison called out, dismounting with the easy grace of a lifelong horseman. "Beautiful day for it." "Coffee's hot," Elijah offered, which was his standard greeting for welcome visitors. "Don't mind if I do," Morrison replied, settling onto the porch steps with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had been making this trip for 2 years. "Got some interesting news from Boulder Creek. Seems Judge Blackwood has been getting inquiries from other territories about your case. Cole, lawyers and judges wanting to know how something like this might work in their jurisdictions." Cole felt a familiar mixture of pride and embarrassment at being the subject of professional attention. "What kind of inquiries?" "The good kind," Morrison assured him. "Questions about rehabilitation programs, supervised probation, victim restitution. Turns out there's a lot of folks in the legal profession who think justice might be better served by fixing people instead of just locking them up." The conversation that followed touched on the broader implications of Cole's case, but it was interrupted by the arrival of Martha Hendricks, who came riding up on her old mare with the purposeful energy of someone conducting business. At 68, Martha remained the unofficial information hub of Redstone Ridge, a role she embraced with enthusiasm and efficiency. "Cole," she called out before dismounting, "I've got a letter for you." Came on the morning train from back east somewhere. The letter was from Mrs. Abernathy in Millerville, now a regular correspondent who had become something of a surrogate grandmother to Cole. Her careful handwriting conveyed news of her family, updates on the town's progress, and always a reminder that forgiveness was possible when coupled with genuine change. "She wants to know if you'll be at the territorial fair this fall," Cole said, reading from the letter. "Says she'd like to introduce you to her granddaughter, who's apparently quite accomplished at training horses herself." Elijah's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Sounds like Mrs. Abernathy has some matchmaking in mind." "Sounds like it," Cole agreed, feeling his cheeks warm slightly. The prospect of romance remained daunting to someone whose past relationships had been defined by deception and impermanence, but the idea was no longer unthinkable. As the afternoon wore on and their visitors departed for town, Cole found himself alone with Elijah and Brutus, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western mountains. The peace that had once seemed impossible now felt as natural as breathing, built from thousands of small moments of honest work and genuine connection. "You know what I'm proudest of?" Elijah said as they prepared to go inside for dinner. "What's that?" "The fact that you're not the same man who kicked my dog 2 years ago, but you remember him clearly enough to make sure he never comes back," Cole nodded, understanding that this was perhaps the most important lesson Elijah had taught him, that redemption wasn't about forgetting the past, but about choosing a different future. The man who had terrorized banks and stolen horses would always be part of his history, but he no longer had to be part of his destiny. As they walked toward the cabin, Brutus padding silently beside them, Cole felt the deep satisfaction of a day well lived and a life well changed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove himself worthy of the trust that had been placed in him. But tonight, he was simply a man going home to a place where he belonged. The last light of day painted the sky in shades of promise, and Cole McGraw, former outlaw, current horse trainer, and living example of the possibility of redemption, was finally completely free.